Hello.
Hey.
Hello. Hey, Dan.
Hi.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
Hello, gentlemen. My name is Ginny. I am the events director at Anderson's Bookshop. It's lovely to meet you both.
Nice
to meet you.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Well, here's our lovely tech check. You have video, you have sound. Tom, I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host, right? Because we're running the presentation off of your.
I am. So why don't I run my video just to make sure it's coming across okay.
All right, let me, in order to share screen, let's see, I have to allow you to make, yeah, I have to make you a co-host so you can share your screen. So there you are.
Great. So I can actually, let me set this up. Slideshow.
Yep.
So
then one day, I'm dashing home. It's, hey, Gord, it's 5 to 8.
So did that play okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I think we're kind of set up.
Fantastic. We can start with that lovely graphic. Great.
So, Tom, again, I'm thinking that I noticed in my copy of the schedule, at least they're looking for maybe 30 minutes or so of discussion, and we've been running more like
50?
45, 50 minutes.
That's okay.
Is it?
Yeah, we don't have a hard end time or anything, leaving some time for questions, but
Sure.
the most important thing is that they're going to hear from most of the two of you. So don't feel like you have to shorten. I mean, I think an hour total is a good end time.
Right.
But within that time, it's totally up to you guys.
Okay. All right. Good. Cool.
Okay. So we'll just riff off each other, Dan. Let's see where it
Yeah,
goes.
that's what we do.
So have you guys done this? You've done this presentation together before?
Yeah, quite a few times. I mean,
Nice.
it varies a little bit from time to time, but we have pretty much a conversational flow that we go through.
Awesome. Well, I know we're excited about it. So I wish, of course, we could have you both here in person, but this way likely we would have been able to get, have both of you here if we were in person. So this is a fun way to have you both here.
Yeah.
So you are at Anderson's?
Yes, I'm with, sorry, I forgot that this is a group event. So I'm with Anderson's Bookshop. So we have a couple other stores that we're, promoting and selling tickets and distributing tickets. So, and I have to go double check. We've done so many of these group events and they're great. But I forget exactly which stores are involved. So I'm going to go double check on that. And make sure to account. I think it's Left Bank.
I know Left Bank's one of them. Yeah. And
and Boswell, I think, is the other one.
that sounds right.
Yeah, there are Midwest buddies. So.
And you are in Naperville, right? Outside of
Naperville. Yep. Yeah.
Naperville.
Yes. So we're a little ways outside of the city, but we are the third largest.
Actually, I remember being driven once out to your store. It's quite a ways out.
Yes. Well, it depends on the traffic, as you
Right.
both know. Tom, you're based out of Seattle area as well, right? So
I am. That's why I
Yes.
did this Seattle backdrop.
yes, love it. Yeah, depending on how the traffic goes. I mean, if there were no traffic, you could get into the city in less than 30 minutes.
Really?
Yeah, but that, only ever happens at like, I don't know, maybe it happens at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't even know. But I've come out of the city, gone into the city and come out of the city at weird times for random things. And you never know when there's going to be traffic. So yeah, I mean, it can take 2 hours,
Yeah,
but
I think, I mean, I was there for a talk at your store years ago. And
Mm,
so I'm sure I was coming from downtown, and I think it was like 5 o'clock in the afternoon or something.
yes,
And
that's,
it
yeah,
took, I don't know if it was 2 hours, but it was quite a slog.
yes. Yes. In that time of traffic, it absolutely is not good.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to freshen my water up here, and I'll be back in a couple minutes.
So Ginny, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'll
Please
be-
do. Yes. I'm gonna get everything settled over here. Tom, can you pronounce your name for me just so that I make sure to get it correct?
Oh, sure. It's Ikeda.
Ikeda, thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Oh, of course. My last name is hyphenated, and so it's Worley Hemeter, and Ginny is hard for some people because it's not Jenny. It's short for Virginia, not Jennifer. So unless they're like Harry Potter fans, they know Ginny Weasley, I get a lot of interesting variations. So I try to always make sure that I'm at least asking and give it my best effort.
No, thank you.
Is that a memorial service you're going to tomorrow? Is that for Norm?
No, it's actually Sarah's aunt. So
Oh,
yeah, so
okay.
that's where it came up. But yeah, there's all sorts of memorial services for Norm. I think there are several.
I'm sure, yeah. Well, don't worry about, the thing tomorrow. I mean, get there whenever you get there. There's I think they've allowed like an hour and a half for lunch. So that's, there's
Yeah.
plenty of leeway there.
Yeah. Dan, what are you wearing tomorrow?
Good question. What are you wearing?
I don't
I'll
know.
probably wear either slacks or black jeans, maybe, and then I don't know, nice shirt.
Sure. Okay. That sounds good. Actually, I might, when I think about it, I might be a little more dressed up because I'm
You
coming
might-
from the memorial service. So
Right. So if you're going to be in a coat, then
I probably will be
okay.
but I can always just take it off too. So
All
whatever.
right. Well, I'll wear a dress shirt and I'll probably bring a coat along at least, and we'll just take it from there.
Okay.
Then if we have, if there are audience questions at the end, did we discuss how we're going to handle those? Are you going to read them in the Q&A or?
Yeah, I think so Ginny, I'll just watch the chat, I think. Is that where?
Sorry, went to get myself some water as well.
Yeah, so Ginny, so for the Q&A at the end, should I just look at chat? And
If that works, I'm also happy to hop in there and facilitate any questions, whatever you're comfortable with.
okay, I'm pretty comfortable with just looking at chat, and
Awesome.
I just usually keep it open just in case someone, even during the talk, if they ask a question, sometimes we can answer it as we're talking.
Yes. And as far as format goes, I'll do a quick intro of everything here at the top and then turn things over to you. I will disappear, but I will be here, and I'll keep an eye on chat, just monitoring things as well for questions or anything that needs be. And then, then I'll, whenever you guys let me know that you're wrapping up, I'll hop back on and kind of wrap things up for us.
Sounds good.
Cool, great.
So what's it like over in Seattle today? Is it?
It's actually quite pleasant after a very cool, wet spring. So I think this weekend we're gonna get in the 70s, so it's gonna be nice.
Oh, that's lovely.
Thank God. May, I think it's the rainiest May. I think actually the first 7 days of May, we got more rain than Seattle ordinarily gets in the whole month of May.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, that's a lot of rain.
Anyway. Yeah, I have family in Kirkland actually.
Yeah.
And we're coming out this summer. But every time I visited Seattle, it's funny you should say, well, actually, it's it's pleasant. Every time I have been there, which is like half a dozen times at this point, the weather is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And I think it's a big hoax. You guys all claim it's terrible weather. And yet I've been there in January. I have been in there in the summer months, and it's always surprisingly lovely. So I think you guys are all involved in a big conspiracy to keep more people from living there. Our spring has been that way too. In fact, April was like one of the second or third wettest April that Chicago has on record.
Wow.
And then last week it was 90 degrees and we had heat indices of over 100, which is insane for early May.
Wow.
I was in some meetings in Georgia earlier this week. So we went from the heat here to Georgia. Well, I expect that in Georgia. I don't expect that heat and humidity in Chicago in early May. So it's been so bizarre. The flowers all bloomed because it finally got warm, but then they all fried because they're spring flowers and they're not designed for 90 degrees. So we had like 4 days of tulips and then they were gone.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Yeah. Well, this is weird. I'm worried about my tomatoes. It's not been warm enough to really get them going. So we shall see.
Yes, I have planted nothing in our vegetable garden yet this year. So I need to do actually tomorrow. I'm thinking to do that. But yes, the weather has just been, I mean, the company that we work with for our ticketing platform, many of their workers are based in Pakistan. And so I was on a call with them last week or the week before. And I said, well, how are you all? And they said, well, we don't even have people at the office because it's too hot to leave.
Yikes.
It's crazy,
Wow.
Yes. All right. Well, we are right at 7. So if you guys are good to go, we'll go ahead and get started.
Sure.
Okay. And I'll continue to admit folks as we go too.
Sure.
Here we go. Good evening, everyone. These are the moments where you are connecting to audio. So we don't want to get into the official stuff, just so that you don't feel like you're missing anything. So instead, we just look happy to see you. And imagine if we were all together, that would be welcoming you in person as well. But we'll go ahead and get started here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jenny. I am the director of events with Anderson's Bookshop. And we are going to go ahead and some quick settings there. There we go. On behalf of, together with all of our friends from Boswell Books and Left Bank Books, some Midwest independent booksellers, we'd like to take a moment to thank you for being with us this evening. As independent bookstores here in the Midwest, we are grateful for your support in each of our communities, always, but especially now as we're sort of moving into the next phase of what, I don't want to say post-COVID, because we're not post, but whatever this next phase is that we're moving into, it really means a lot for us to have you join us this evening. So thank you for being with us. All 3 of our stores have many other event offerings in both virtual and in-person formats. So please check out our websites and our social media platforms for more details to find the next one for you. And a quick accessibility note, excuse me. We have turned on the live transcript feature. So if you'd like subtitles or a full transcript as provided by Zoom, you can choose that using the live transcript or the CC button at the bottom of your own screen. But tonight we are thrilled to be celebrating the paperback release of Facing the Mountain. Please welcome the author, Daniel James Brown, who is the author of The Boys in the Boat, The Indifferent Stars Above and Under a Flaming Sky, in addition to Facing the Mountain, who is joining us from outside of Seattle. And he will be in conversation with Tom Ikeda, a former executive director of Densho, a Seattle-based nonprofit dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing Japanese American history and promoting social justice and equity. And as you may be able to see, he is also joining us from outside the Seattle area, repping your city there. I love it. Welcome to you both. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So Jenny, I'll start this with,
Yeah.
and I'll moderate this conversation with Dan. And again, welcome to everyone. This is always fun to talk about Facing the Mountain. And this is going to be kind of just a fun conversation between Dan and me, talking about how we met, how the book came about. We'll talk quite a bit about the book and some of the characters in there, and actually show some oral history clips of these characters. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about why this book's important, the relevance of this book to today. And then we'll have Q&A. And if you have any questions during the program, feel free to use the chat, and I'll be watching that also. So Dan, why don't I get started by first talking a little bit about how we met, and then go from there. But it's been now 7 years when we first met, and we were both accepting awards at the Seattle Center, the Mayor's Arts Awards, where I was there accepting an award for the organization I founded called Densho, which for the last 26 years, we've been collecting and preserving the stories of the Japanese American experience during World War II. So we have over 1,000 oral histories, about 100,000 historic photographs, documents, newspapers. It's all online so people can get access to it. And our thinking was, if we can collect these stories and just make them accessible, make them available, then people will learn. They'll start using them. Content creators like Dan Brown will find them, and they'll create things. So I was there at the Seattle Center accepting an award for that. And I was really equally excited to actually meet, Dan Brown, because I was a big fan of The Boys in the Boat. I'm a University of Washington graduate and a big sports fan. So, actually Crew was something I had followed as a kid. And so I was really interested in meeting Dan and how he, did his story. But the fun thing was when we were on the stage, we actually had a conversation where we started talking about Japanese American history, and you were genuinely interested. And I thought, oh, maybe Dan will do something. So I'm curious, Dan, what was your take when we first met?
Yeah, I sat there listening to your presentation about all you've done with Densho and collecting all these oral histories. And as you were talking about it, my wheels were starting to turn because, for one thing, I've always had an interest in Japanese American history for a variety of reasons. But I'm also just always interested in firsthand accounts of history. And it was very clear to me from what you were saying that you had compiled these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of oral histories, that might be, a rich, fertile ground for storytelling. And I also gathered from what you were saying that a lot of the oral histories you had collected were about second generation Japanese Americans, Nisei, and their experiences during the World War II years. And so I'm sort of always interested in that generation of Americans, Japanese Americans, or whatever their ethnicity might be. And that is, that's reflected in The Boys in the Boat. So, just listening to you, I got pretty excited. And then I went home that evening and I got online. I got on the Densho website, and I started actually listening to some of these oral histories that you've collected. And I was just, mesmerized by a lot of these stories. These were deeply felt personal stories about young men and women and their families coming together under very difficult circumstances, persevering, getting through hard times. The same kinds of themes, this is in a Japanese American context, but the same kinds of themes that I was exploring in The Boys in the Boat. So the more I listened to, the more interested I got. And then, as you know, contacted you, and we began this dialogue that went on over the next year or so about how to take some of these stories and turn them into a book.
And for me, that time when you started, looking at the stories and we started talking was actually a really fun time for me because, obviously, this work is really important to me, and to be able to be engaged with you, talking about the stories, and then watching you, because it wasn't just you kind of looking at a few stories and then talking to me about what to do. I mean, you dived into the art, not only the Densho archive, but archives in Hawaii and California, and so it was really interesting to see in some ways how you were trying to craft a story, because frankly, in those early days, and even now, there's just so many stories. It's hard for me sometimes to even kind of talk about it in a brief way, because I want to go down all these different paths. And I know when we first started talking, I probably was like that, saying, well, Dan, there's this story, there's this experience, there's on, and you kept kind of listening, but then you kept kind of, I think in some ways, going back and forth, trying to narrow the subject area.
Yeah. So, one of the way I write, I didn't really want to try to write a comprehensive history of the Japanese American experience during World War II. That's just not what I do. What I try to do is I try to write deeply personal stories about one character or a limited set of characters, so my readers can really get to know them as individuals, them and their families, and then weave those stories together in a way that sheds some light on a slice of history. So I needed to narrow the field down. And as you say, there were so many different stories, and I couldn't go in all those directions at once. So what I finally decided to do was to focus on young men, young Japanese American men of draft age, because it seemed to me they had a particularly interesting dilemma at the beginning of World War II. I mean, all Japanese Americans, anybody of Japanese descent in this country, had all kinds of difficulties, particularly beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor and all that followed. But young Nisei men, young men of draft age, they had a particular dilemma that really interested me. You know, they were, after Pearl Harbor, their high school friends and their neighborhood friends, their buddies, were all rushing down to enlistment offices and signing up to serve in the military. At the same time, when they went downtown to the enlistment office and tried to sign up, they were told that they couldn't, that they were something called an enemy alien, even though they were in fact American citizens. At the same time that that's happening, they, in some cases, and their family members are being rounded up, forced out of their homes, and sent to these camps all over the American West. So, you know, dilemmas are what drive stories forward. And I was just interested in that question of, okay, what is the right thing to do? What's the courageous thing to do, the moral thing to do, the patriotic thing to do? If you're a young American of Japanese descent, Pearl Harbor has happened. And what do you do now? Do you resist with every fiber of your being the government that has incarcerated your family? Or, you know, do you sign up to serve? If you aren't allowed to serve, then what are you to do with that? So that's the starting point. I wound up with 4 young men of draft age that I decided to focus on.
And when you talked about, you know, you love, you know, as a writer, dilemma, you know, let's start with this first one, because I think, you know, the first one we're going to talk about, Gordon Hirabayashi, really captures, I think, this sense of the dilemma. And let me bring this screen up and actually, yeah, here's a photograph of Gordon, you know, about the time when he was, you know, when World War II started. And we're going to start with Gordon because he actually confronted the government. This was an unusual, rare occurrence during World War II with Japanese Americans. Most actually went along, but Gordon was this, I would say, extraordinary individual who actually decided to defy the government. So talk a little bit about Gordon and how you write about him in your book.
Yeah, so Gordon was a young man of very strongly held convictions. He wanted to live his life according to his moral compass, based on principles, largely principles found in the American Constitution. And so he was a student at the University of Washington when Pearl Harbor happened. One of the first things that happened with Japanese Americans, actually anybody of Japanese descent in Seattle, was that a curfew was imposed on them. And so they weren't allowed to be out on the streets of Seattle after 8 p.m. Gordon, at first he obeyed that curfew, but after a short while, he got to thinking about it. And because he had these strong convictions about the American Constitution and what it meant, and his determination to live by his principles, he came to a point pretty early on when he decided that he was going to resist the curfew, violate the curfew, in fact, and thereby break the law. So that's the first thing that he did. And actually, I think we have a clip of him talking in his own words about coming to that decision.
Yeah, so here's on the screen, and there you see Gordon, an interview I did with him about 20 years ago. And in this clip, as Dan says, he's talking about his decision to defy the the curfew order. So he's at the library at the University of Washington, Suzulo Library, and as Dan mentioned, 8 p.m. curfew. So 5 minutes to 8 is when Gordon usually would grab his books and run to his room. And but this night was different. So let's listen to Gordon.
Then one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gord, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff and take about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home. And it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there. I didn't, it just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, you know, without saying I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
Dan, as I just watched that clip, I realized, when I read your book, how well you captured so much the personality and characteristics of these characters. And as I look at the oral histories and your writing, the masterful job you did that. But going back to Gordon, so he defied the curfew. What happened next? And Dan, you have you're muted right now. Oh, Dan, you're muted right now.
One sec, let me help there. All right, try now, Dan.
Great. Okay, you should be able to hear me. It was set so I couldn't unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Dan. Go ahead.
Okay, so go ahead and ask the question again, Tom. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the question was, so in that last clip, Gordon defied the curfew. And then after that, what did Gordon do? I mean, it was more than just defying a curfew. He actually
that was really, the first step for Gordon. The more he thought about it, the more the incarceration of other Japanese Americans, of course, began to eat at him. It was clearly in his mind unconstitutional. So, so when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to get on buses and be taken away to the camps, he just didn't get on the bus. And he became the last Japanese American living in Seattle. What he did instead is he wrote out this very, very articulate, clearly laid out statement addressed to the FBI, explaining in constitutional terms why he thought both the curfew and these incarcerations were immoral and unconstitutional. And he took that statement in his hand and he went downtown with a lawyer and walked into the FBI offices and handed them this statement and said, I'm not willing to be incarcerated, and I'm not willing to sign the registration form that would allow you to incarcerate me. And this threw the FBI agents into a complete turmoil. They didn't know what to do with this sort of odd young man. So they spent the rest of that day driving Gordon around Seattle to different places, trying to get him to sign this piece of paper that would legally allow them to take him to Puyallup, which is where Japanese Americans were first taken before they were sent to permanent camps. And Gordon just wouldn't do it. He wouldn't sign the piece of paper. He said, you've got big guys here. You can throw me in the back of a car, drive me to Puyallup, lock me up, but I'm not going to sign your piece of paper. And so he wound up that night in the King County Jail in downtown Seattle. And he spent the rest of the war years fighting this legal battle, winding up in and out of jail and county work farms, and finally winding up in a federal prison as his case worked its way up to the US Supreme Court. So, he's just a fascinating young man, one who stood on principle, and I thought he would be a good voice to represent that side of the dilemma that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, he was a great choice, and it took a lot of courage. I mean, as you talked about the things he did. But let's move on to the other three. And the next three we're going to talk about all decided to serve in the military. And that took a different type of courage. And the next person we're going to go to is Katsugo Miho, or Katz Miho was Katz was his nickname. And I'm so glad you chose cats because most of my research, I've done over 250 oral histories, but most of them have been Japanese Americans who were on the mainland and who went to the camps during World War II, or taken to the camps. But you did a lot of research on the islands where there were actually more Japanese Americans in Hawaii than there was on the West Coast, and yet they had a very different experience. So talk about Katz Miho and his role in the book.
Yeah, so Katz grew up on Maui at a time when Maui was basically one large sugarcane plantation. His family ran a little hotel on Maui, but he was actually a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. In fact, he was on the roof of his residence hall. He went up there to view what was happening at Pearl Harbor. And while he was there, he heard on the radio that anybody in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, was to come to the University of Hawaii's campus immediately. And he was an ROTC candidate, or cadet rather. So he put on his uniform, he ran across the street along with hundreds of other young men, many of them Japanese American. And they assembled in a sort of gymnasium on the University of Hawaii campus. And they were issued these old 1903 Springfield rifles and I think 5 bullets. And they were that afternoon turned into sort of on the spot, they were formed into something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And they were told that it was going to be their task to defend Oahu against what everybody expected would be an imminent invasion by Japanese imperial forces. So that night, Katz found himself down on the waterfront in Honolulu in a sort of industrial neighborhood in the dark, patrolling back and forth, expecting at any moment that Japanese Marines would be landing, and he would have to fight them off. He was very, very proud of that moment, proud to be in uniform and be right there on the scene and able to do something about it. But his time in the Territorial Guard, Hawaii Territorial Guard, came to a sort of unexpected end a couple of months later, and we have Katz talking about what happened.
Yes. So this next clip is Katz Miho, and yeah, just one of the favorite things I remember when I picked up your book. You actually start in the book with Katz Miho, and my wife and I were reading it together, and she was interested because you mentioned that the girls in Hawaii thought he was like a movie star in terms of not only his looks but I think his charisma, which I think you'll hear when you listen to this clip here. Let me go ahead.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts. And for 2-3 nights in a row, we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told you load it this way, this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. And to this day, I wonder what was if anything happened was what they were referring to. Because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened? What were we supposed to do? Because we're not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. We woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the acting commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right in his face, says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans or Japanese, that I'm pretty sure he referred to Americans or Japanese ancestry. Because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged heroin right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian territory. Only the AJ is completely still a shock.
It's so I enjoy so much watching these clips. I mean, I could watch Cats for hours in terms of him just sharing stories. He's such a great storyteller. But this was at the end a very difficult and emotional. I think when I read the book, this was the first time I really teared up when you described the scene.
Yeah, well, in fact, I mean, this was like in the pre-dawn darkness on an athletic field in Honolulu, and these young men are standing around in the dark, and they are told they're not welcome to serve anymore because of their ethnicity. And it was a moment of absolute shock to many of them. In fact, many of them talking about that morning said in the darkness around them, they could hear other young men weeping in the darkness. So, it was very, very traumatic.
Yeah. So the first gentleman we highlighted was Gordon from Seattle. He was kind of the resistor. We just talked about Katz Miho, Japanese American from Hawaii, that experience. The third one, we're going to come back to the mainland and go to California. And let me bring this up. And he's a favorite character of both of us. Another great storyteller, but kind of a rascal too, Rudy Tokiwa. So talk about Rudy and his role in the
yeah.
book.
So Rudy was a bit of a rascal. He wasn't particularly a rule follower, let's just say, and he got in trouble a lot. But he had just this huge, warm heart. Rudy grew up in a farm on a farm in Salinas, California, and his family was shortly after Pearl Harbor. They were forced from their home, and they were taken first to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, which was made into what they called an assembly center. And after some time there, he and his family were shipped to one of the largest of these American concentration camps at Poston, Arizona. And as you can imagine, one of these camps in Poston was particularly hot, dry, bleak, dusty, miserable place, of course, particularly in the summer. But so Rudy was living with his parents and his brother at Poston when in the spring of 1943, the Roosevelt administration reversed course. Up until that point, they had refused to allow Japanese Americans to enlist in the US Army, labeling them as enemy aliens. But early in the spring of 1943, the administration, realizing it was, amongst other things, wasting all this manpower, decided to create something called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and segregated all Japanese American fighting unit within the US Army. And the news of the 442nd's creation came out when it came out. The young men at Poston got into very heated debates about what the right thing to do was. Many of them felt that the last thing in the world they should do was fight and die for the country that had incarcerated them and their parents and their siblings and their grandparents. Other of those young men, though, thought, well, if we enlist in the Army and fight and bleed and perhaps die, at least after the war, perhaps things will be better for Japanese Americans when we come back as veterans. So a day came when the young men at Poston decided they needed to hash this out. And so they all met under some mesquite trees in the camp. And they had this great debate unfold. And Rudy was one of those young men. He was only 17 at the time, but he was one of those who stood up and said, I think we should enlist and we should fight because it's the only way we're ever going to get any respect as Americans. And surely when we come back having fought, we will be treated better. So he joined the 442nd and was sent off to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, which is where their basic training was held. And then from there, he was shipped to Europe. The 442nd landed first in Italy at Anzio.
And Dan, before we talk about Europe, I just want to, you mentioned earlier how much you as a writer like to have situations where there's dilemmas or tension. And when Rudy went to Camp Shelby to train, that's where he met a lot of the Japanese Americans from Hawaii. And so you had these two groups who were very different in terms of culturally, but also in terms of how they were treated during the war. You had Japanese Americans from Hawaii where, they retained their freedoms and they were kind of, at the location where Japan attacked, the United States. And the number of people who wanted to volunteer and fight was very large compared to Japanese Americans on the mainland, like Rudy, who were actually removed from their homes and placed in these camps, like 110,000, Japanese Americans, they were very reluctant. They had this different sense. And when these two groups came together, they didn't get along and they struggled, they fought, and you really captured that tension. But I love, and people need to read the book, but eventually they came together. And part of the story, which I love that you brought in, was to help bring them together as a unit. They took a lot of the Japanese Americans from Hawaii to a nearby, one of the concentration camps that held Japanese Americans in Arkansas. And at that moment, the Japanese Americans from Hawaii said, "Oh my gosh, this is what our fellow soldiers have come from." And so I think that really bounded them. And then they went to Europe. I just wanted to kind of talk about that. And there's other great stories. I mean, in terms of, the allyship, in terms of fighting racism, Japanese American soldiers, this was their first experience of being in the Deep South. And, the stories you mentioned in terms of when they were kind of appalled to see the segregation in the South. And there's a story from Rudy where, he and some buddies, they were on a bus going back to the base, and an African-American soldier comes on and he's kind of forced to go to the back. And Rudy and those guys said, "What are you doing? Come back and sit with us." And when the white bus driver said, no, he has to sit back there, Rudy and his friends just grab this guy and throw him off the bus, this white guy. And then they drive, the African-American and them back to base. I mean, it's great stories.
Yeah, there were, that whole business at Camp Shelby was like, from a storytelling point of view, just pure gold, because it was so interesting, for one thing, understanding the different cultural context of the Hawaiian Japanese Americans and the mainlanders. And again, that illustrates sort of Rudy's view of the world and the view of rules and things. He was good at getting into what John Lewis called good trouble. They threw that driver off the bus and drove it back to base themselves. Anyway, from Camp Shelby, they went off to the war in Europe. And then, as I say, they fought first in Italy. They fought their way through Tuscany, taking very heavy casualties. In Tuscany is a place where every hilltop almost has a town on the top of it. And so the Germans were always entrenched in these towns, and the Japanese American soldiers had to constantly be fighting their way up the side of some hill or some mountain to dislodge the Germans. And they did this for months that summer, moving their way northward through Tuscany. They finally reached the Arno River, and at that point, they were sent north to the French-German border. And that's actually where they experienced the most dramatic fighting and sort of the climatic battles that they would see. The Vosges is a very mountainous, dark, impenetrable sort of region right on the German border. And what happened is they were given first the mission of liberating a town called Bruyere. And they fought very hard for several days in miserable fighting conditions. It's October of 1944 now. It's raining and sleety. So they take very heavy casualties. They finally liberate the town, this French town. They move deeper into the Vosges to a place called Belmont, and then to a place called Bifontaine. And then finally, after days of miserable fighting, they're told to go take a couple nights rest. So they go off to find haylofts or barns or cellars or someplace dry to get the mud off themselves and to get some sleep. But in the second night, they're awakened in the middle of the night and told to put their combat gear back on. And so they find themselves starting up this mountain, not quite sure why or what they're getting into, again, in pouring down rain. And what had happened is the commanding general of the entire division, what's often called the Texas Division, General Dahlquist, had sent a unit of his soldiers, mostly young men from Texas and Oklahoma, too far into the Vosges forest, and they'd become surrounded and cut off by the Germans. And many of them are wounded. Some of them are dying. They're out of food. They're out of medical supplies. They have no drinkable water. So Dahlquist, realizing he's made this error in sending them there, sends one unit after another of his Texas division up to try to break through and get them out, and nobody can. So finally, as I say, in the middle of the night, he calls up the Nisei soldiers to 442nd and sends them up the mountain. And over the next couple of days, in absolutely hellacious fighting, taking enormous casualties, they finally reach the top of the mountain. They break through and they get the Texans out of there. They themselves, however, are not allowed to come back down off the mountain. They have to fight still deeper into the Vosges. So it's several more days before they finally come back down off the mountain. But when they do, they have liberated this contingent of Texas soldiers.
Yeah, and when they come off, you mentioned General Dahlquist, because they rescued those Texans, he wanted to acknowledge them, and he wanted them to do what was called a retreat parade, where the unit would march in front of him, and he would be on a platform and essentially salute them. And at full strength, the 442nd is a little more than 4,000 men. And the fighting that you just described in that month, brought the unit down to less than 1,000, less than, in Rudy's words, less than a battalion. And because of the number of killed in action, the wounded, men who got trench feet and were sick. The general was, I think, anticipating seeing at least 2,000 or 3,000 men march in front of him. So rather than being, kind of pleased to see this unit and acknowledge him, he actually was angry. And so here in this clip, let's see. Yeah, so we're going to have Rudy kind of talk about, what happened as the 442 marched in front of General Dahlquist.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review. And like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters. And they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I ordered everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
Yeah, I interviewed Rudy over 20 years ago, and I still vividly remember that interview because he continues to tear up, and Rudy and a couple of dozen other men that I interviewed about this battle in that time, they had lost so many of their friends. I mean, the casualties were immense, and to kind of top it off, to feel disrespected, by this general, really made them, pretty angry, most of them.
Yeah, watching that clip was one of the things that, especially the extended version of that clip, when I saw how emotional Rudy got, one of the things that convinced me I really wanted to write this book. You forget without these kinds of firsthand stories, without somebody like you saving these stories and recording them, the wars become just a piece of history, and you forget the human toll and the human emotions involved in it. And, Rudy was really a tough guy. So when you saw him tearing up and sort of breaking down a little bit, you really get this sense of what a gut-wrenching thing this was, to be disrespected in the way that they were by that general.
Yeah. Which kind of brings us to the fourth one, who, we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of the, the aftermath of all that fighting and the impact on this person. But he also is a person that, brings another perspective. So it's, Fred Shiosaki. And so he is another Washingtonian, but he lived on the eastern side of the state. And in Japanese American history, they designated the west side of the state as an exclusion zone. And so Japanese Americans, where most of them lived, were rounded up and placed in those, American concentration camps. But Fred, being on the east side of the state, wasn't impacted by the exclusion orders. And so his experience was different. And so talk about Fred and his role in the book.
Yeah. So Fred, I think you and I both, again, have soft spots, especially for Fred. Fred just passed away about a year ago. He was, of the four guys that I profile in the book, Fred was the only one who was still alive when I began this project. So I was able to spend quite a bit of time with him. And he was such an interesting guy in so many ways. He grew up in Spokane. His family ran a laundry in Spokane, a neighborhood down by the railroad yards in Spokane. And he was one of the young men who immediately after Pearl Harbor rushed downtown Spokane and went into the enlistment office and tried to sign up, and was told that he couldn't do that he was an enemy alien. And it was, devastating for him, again, because his friends and his buddies were all signing up. So he was very depressed about that. He spent the next year attending Gonzaga University in Spokane, but without really much interest in that. And he found it really kind of a humiliating experience, because he was virtually the only male student on campus, except for some naval cadets who were already in uniform and were being trained at Gonzaga. So it was a really hard year for Fred. But then when the 442nd was created, he immediately went downtown again and did in fact enlist. He didn't tell his parents right away that he enlisted. He kept that secret for a couple of months until it was time to actually go off and report to basic training. But Fred is in the book partly also because he was in K Company along with Rudy Tokiwa. And K Company along with I Company were the two companies that led that assault on the German positions for the rescue of the Lost Battalion. So like Rudy, Fred was very involved in that battle, fought his way up the side of that mountain. That was a particularly scarring experience, I think, for Fred. He lost at least one very close friend who was right next to him as they were going up the mountain. And it traumatized him. So he came home, came home angry and upset about all that had happened in his service.
Yeah, so we're going to show this this next clip where again, I think it's a really interesting clip because it does show kind of the impact of fighting. So Fred's on his way back to Spokane. This is after the war. He's back in the States. He's in Washington, D.C. At the train station, taking a train across the country. And he happens to run into another soldier who was in the Lost Battalion. And so here, Fred talks about meeting the soldier.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. Actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure there must have been a Union station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were there for 42nd?" Yeah. I says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, "You know, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, when I interviewed Fred, it surprised me when he told me the story because, as we know, he's such a kind, gentle man. And so I asked him, "So why did you do that? Why didn't you shake his hand?" And again, he just said, all he could think was, his friends who were killed. And I think at that point when that other soldier said, "Oh, we would have come after you," he just didn't think that was going to happen. And so, he just couldn't shake that person's hand. So it was really, really powerful.
Yeah, and it's sort of indicative of, of course, not just Japanese Americans, but all veterans of that war and other wars are often scarred, often experience PTSD. Fred, for instance, when he finally got home, he moved back into the apartment up over the laundry with his parents for a while. And I know for quite some time, his mother had to awaken him in the middle of the night, almost every night, because he was screaming in his sleep. So, and it wasn't just him. Actually, of the three guys that I talk about in the book who served in the military, all of them had a hard time sort of adjusting after the war in various ways. And actually, not just those, many of the other veterans I talked to said the same thing.
Yeah. So this next phase, so we're going to kind of move and talk about, in some ways, something for me that was unexpected when you're writing the book, in terms of what was happening in our country these last several years actually mirrored or what I call, let me put this up here, rhymes with history. And so 7 years ago we started working on this book, and when we were doing the research, little things would happen that would kind of remind us of the history. And so one example I want to talk about were some of the primary sources that you were looking at. So this is an article from 1905 from the San Francisco Chronicle, and you were looking, and I was looking at ways that things like negative rhetoric can impact things in terms of how people look at a particular kind of group. And here, back in 1905, it portrays Japanese as dangerous, as subversive, that the immigration of Japanese was viewed not as an immigration, but as an invasion, that there was some kind of plan, conspiracy by the Japanese government to essentially take over the United States by essentially replacing the people who were there. this is example. It wasn't so much exactly when you were writing the book, but I bring this one up because of what happened, last weekend in Buffalo, and how the shooter there of the 10 who killed 10 African Americans, how he was professing this replacement theory as this essentially this paranoid kind of conspiracy plan that there's a plan to replace white people in America. But it's just interesting in terms of the rhyming, how this article from 117 years ago is very similar in terms of that, in terms of what people were saying in terms of that, and furthermore, and this is in terms of other things that were rhyming. Just later on, there was the Muslim travel ban that was sort of justified as a national security or military military necessity, and how that paralleled in terms of the arguments that the government used against Japanese Americans to incarcerate them, that it was a military necessity. Yet there really wasn't. If you kind of scrape off the veneer of what people were saying, it really was this discriminatory kind of practice, and how as we went through this, more and more, these things would come up in terms of family detention and separation, and it was very eerie in some ways as you were writing the book to see these things unfold, and again how much they rhymed with history. I wanted to get your take on this.
Yeah, I mean, that was very much my experience in the researching and the writing too. When I was first starting the book, I was doing a lot of research and reading about Japanese immigrants coming to the United States, because I wanted to talk not just about these guys, but about their families and their origins. And so by day, I was reading about and studying about these hardworking Japanese families that immigrated to Hawaii or to the West Coast of the United States, and all that they went through. And then, I come home at night and listen to the news, and there was all this sort of vicious anti-immigrant rhetoric on the news every night. And when I was researching and writing about the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, I was coming home and reading about and hearing on the news about, incarcerations of children and other large, groups of people on our southern border. So, and those are just a couple of examples. There were all these things that kept coming up. And I think the thing that most alarmed me and still alarms me was the language, because one of the things I did in preparing to write the book was I did sort of a deep dive into the history of Asian immigration to the United States. So I went back and I read a whole bunch of stuff about Chinese immigration to the West Coast of the United States around, at the time of the gold rush in the late 1840s, early 1850s. And I was reading about all this overt violence directed at Chinese immigrants, but also the kinds of language that were directed at them. They were talked in terms of dogs and locusts and rats and vermin. And then a little later, around the turn of the century, during this period where they were talking about the yellow peril, newspapers all across the country, but especially on the West Coast, we're printing, again, all this stuff equating Asian immigrants. Now we're talking about Japanese immigrants also as, again, bringers of disease and vermin and snakes and rats. And then that happened again, right after Pearl Harbor. It's not just that there was a lot of hatred that boiled up. It was always couched in the same kinds of terms. Those same memes and tropes and images were brought up. And so it was particularly alarming to me to find in my own time, the times we're living in now, in the last few years, and especially, during the Trump administration, again, the very same images and associations being equated with Asian immigrants as bringers of disease. And so you hear somebody talking about Kung flu. I mean, these aren't accidents. These associations, these ideas, these images, these tropes are at this point, they're deeply embedded in the American consciousness. Hollywood had a lot to do with perpetuating a lot of these ideas. And so they're there, they're ready-made, in already existing, ready to be brought up by politicians who would want to weaponize them. So yeah, I found that striking, impossible to ignore, and very alarming. I think we lost somebody.
So, so at this point, I mean, we want to, have some time for questions. If you have a question, you could put it in. I think chat is what probably works the best, and I'll ask Dan that question. But as people are thinking of possible questions, Dan, I just want to, kind of, people have asked me oftentimes, because I work at Densho, and what can we do like today in terms of fighting against some of the racism and ignorance in our country. And in many ways, your book does this, because I think you're such a powerful storyteller. And by you really doing the research, listening to these stories, and then writing them in such an engaging way, you can really feel connected to these Japanese Americans. And most people in the country don't know Japanese Americans. And I think through your writings, they will feel connected, not them as a separate group, but really as these Americans. I mean, with their strengths and flaws. I think that's really powerful. And then in just writing their story, I think as we're talking about, you can't help but notice, like, oh, this is, what happened to Japanese Americans and how unfair that was. Similar things are happening today. We're making similar mistakes. And I think that's going to be really helpful for people to read the book, and read it with others, talk about it. I think that's a really powerful experience.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I mean, I guess in light of all that's happening, the best all of us can do is use whatever our particular talents or skill sets might happen to be to try to shed light on some of these things. I do think that, I think, for instance, in regard to Japanese American history and the incarceration of Japanese Americans, I think way too many people, at least outside the Japanese American community, think that that's just, old news, water under the bridge, piece of history that we've moved on from, not really that relevant today, and may question why we're telling these stories now. The opposite is true. It's never been more relevant since the war than it is now. So, as I say, my mission in life as a writer is to tell personal stories so that my readers, instead of just reading abstract histories, actually get to know Rudy Tokiwa and his mom and his brother, get to know Katsumiho and what happened with his sister who was living in Japan, get to know the kids who liberated concentration camps in Germany, that some of them Japanese Americans. These are personal stories, and I think once people connect with these people, these young men and their families on a personal basis, it's much easier to see how relevant the history is today.
Yeah. And Dan, you probably can't see this on your screen, but I just noticed that Mariko Miho is part of the audience. And as you talk about kind of the different characters and getting to know them, this is a great opportunity to talk a little bit about the research you did with the families in terms of finding materials and how helpful Mariko and others were in doing that.
Yeah, well, since Mariko's there, first of all, hi, Mariko. And let me talk about her family in particular. So I met Mariko actually through Brian, your historian at Densho, was the one who gave me the contact information, Tom. But I went to Honolulu and met with her, and she took me to her mother's house. Her dad has passed away, but her mom is still with us. And and she had saved in a back room of the house just all kinds of stuff stacked up that were, shed all kinds of light. And then she just spent a lot of time with me talking about her dad. She took me up to the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu to see where her dad was buried. She showed me photos of her dad with Senator Inouye. And, those kinds of personal contacts, spending time with family members, that's just hugely helpful to me as a writer to accomplish what I was just talking about, which is making the story personal. You can, nobody knows other family members like family members. And so if Katz wasn't there to talk to in person, his family members were there to talk. And so, just, I can't emphasize enough how helpful that was and how grateful I am to her and to other family members who shared their loved ones' lives with me.
Great. So I'm going to do one more question. We're at the hour, but I want to do this one too, because another friend, Kevin Miyazaki, Kevin is this amazing photographer and has done a book about the camps we were talking about. But his question is that his family was at Tule Lake and Heart Mountain. He has relatives from Hawaii and other family friends who served in the 442nd and 100th Battalion. And the question he has is if you could touch upon the feelings of those who chose not to enlist. He assumes that there would be feelings of guilt and maybe questions of patriotism by others, by other people in society, as well as their peers and the J community. So I think, the question is in particular the draft resistors and how maybe they felt, in touching upon that.
Yeah, so I think you're ultimately much better qualified than I am to talk about that because you've collected so many histories. But I do want to say that, in writing the book the way I did, I wasn't able to go as deeply into some topics as I would have liked to. For instance, the Military Intelligence Service, fascinating story. The story of what came to be called the No-No Boys, those who, once conscription of Japanese Americans began, refused to be conscripted. Absolutely fascinating. And the novel No-No Boys does a great job telling that story. But I do deal with it to some extent, and I do know that within the confines even of individual families, this was a very fraught decision, and oftentimes divided families, one family from another. You can imagine if you're in one of these camps like Poston, and your son's off fighting in Italy, and the other family's son is refusing to be conscripted, divisions naturally arose. It was a deeply traumatic thing, which is what goes back to what I was saying about dilemma. These are really pivotal, central human dilemmas that happen to play out in this particular context.
Yeah, and I'll just make a note. Kevin, you mentioned that your family was both Tule Lake and Heart Mountain. And in particular, Heart Mountain is known, the Heart Mountain Resistors, which in the community we have, labeled them or call them the Resistors of Conscience, in that they took this very intentional stand. When men were being drafted to fight while they were still behind barbed wires, they discussed it. They actually wrote a lot, and they realized that what was happening to them and the community was wrong. And so on principle, many of them resisted. And so, although they took a lot of criticism, both from, the court system where, ultimately they ended up, serving time in federal penitentiaries. They also took a lot of flack from the community for taking that stand. But I think today, they're viewed as taking a very honorable, principled stand, but as hard as it was to do that. So great question, Kevin. Dan, let's bring Ginny back, but as she's coming back on, I just want to thank you. It's always fun to just talk about, your work, the book, its relevance to today. I mean, there's just so many things that we can keep talking about. It's really, really powerful.
Yeah, well, it's who should be thanking you, Tom. None of this work would have happened if it hadn't been for all the work you did over 26 years collecting all those stories.
Thanks to you both. I'll echo that sentiment as well. What an amazing connection the two of you have, and collaboration to work to share these really, really important stories. So we really are grateful to both of you for bringing that, collecting that, and putting it in a format and bringing it out to all of us so we can enjoy it and honor its importance. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone joining us this evening as well. Dan, real quick before we go, I know we're celebrating the paperback release of this book, and I don't want to rush you, but is there anything else down the road that we can look forward to that you can talk about?
Not anything I can talk about right now. I'm going to take a little bit of a break and think about a few things.
I think that is well deserved. And Tom, is there a focus for you right this moment on anything that we can support?
You always can support Densho at densho.org. You mentioned I'm the former executive director. Actually, I'm still the executive director.
I'm sorry, I had that information wrong then, and what was given to me.
Yeah, I announced my retirement, but probably still going to be around for a couple of months at least. So
got it. All right, so you're in transition, slowly edging your way towards perhaps some more time to read some more books.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It has been great to have you all with us. And thank you, of course, to Dan and to Tom for sharing your time with us. If you purchased a ticket that came with a signed copy of the book, just FYI, that will be mailed out or available for pickup for you in the coming days. But please reach out to the bookstore that you signed up with if you have additional questions about that timeline. And thank you, everyone. Be safe out there. Happy reading. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you all in person very soon. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.